All right, let's go. Number 7. The last glacial maximum and the frozen erasure of the Paleolithic world. Between roughly 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, a quarter of Earth's land surface vanished beneath ice. Not coastline, not mountain peaks, a quarter of every continent on the planet. In the highlands of what would one day be called Switzerland, in the river valleys of what would one day be called Ohio, in the plains that would one day feed the populations of northern Europe, there was no soil, no vegetation, no animal life. There was ice, sheets of it 3 kilometers thick. Walls of frozen water, taller than any structure humanity has ever built, grinding southward over a world that had no name for what was happening to it. The Laurentide ice sheet alone buried the entire northern half of North America beneath a single continuous glacier. The Fennoscandian ice sheet did the same to Scandinavia and extended down through the British Isles and into northern Germany. Sea levels dropped by 120 meters as the planet's water locked itself into ice. Continental shelves emerged as dry land. The world map of 20,000 years ago would be unrecognizable to a modern eye. Larger continents, smaller oceans, a planet partially mummified in white, and the cold was patient. It had nowhere to be. It advanced over centuries, retreated for a generation, then advanced again. Forests that had stood for 10,000 years were ground into gravel. River systems were rerouted or erased entirely. Entire latitudinal bands of the planet became uninhabitable to anything larger than lichen. What lived through this was the megafauna. The woolly mammoth, 10 tons of muscle and tusk insulated against killing cold. The woolly rhinoceros, a horned tank built for the steppe. The cave bear, larger than any bear that walks the earth today. The giant Irish elk, whose antlers spanned nearly 4 meters from tip to tip. These were not curiosities. These were the dominant terrestrial animals of the Eurasian landscape. They had survived previous glaciations. They had adapted to conditions that would kill a modern human in hours. They were built for the world the ice had made. And then, across a window of a few thousand years, they were gone. Not diminished. Not relegated to refugia in remote valleys. Gone. The mammoth, the rhinoceros, the cave bear, the Irish elk, dozens of other large-bodied species across Europe and northern Asia, all erased from the living world within the same narrow geological window. Their bones accumulated in caves and bogs and the thawing edges of retreating glaciers. The ecosystem they had defined for hundreds of thousands of years simply ceased to exist. In the permafrost of Siberia, the evidence of what was lost continues to surface. Frozen mammoths emerge from the thawing soil with their reddish-brown fur still attached to their skin. Their last meals are still inside their stomachs, identifiable down to the species of grass. Some have been so well preserved that researchers can examine the contents of their final breath. These are not fossils in the conventional sense. These are bodies. Animals that lay down in a world that no longer exists and never got up, preserved by the same cold that eventually killed everything they knew. But the megafauna were not the only casualties. In Western Europe, a sophisticated Paleolithic culture known as the Solutreans had developed during the depths of the glacial maximum. They produced some of the finest stone tools ever made by human hands. Laurel leaf blades pressure flaked to translucent thinness. Spear points of such precision that modern flint knappers struggle to replicate them. They painted in caves. They organized hunts of mammoth and reindeer across the frozen plains of what is now France and Spain. They were not primitive. They were a fully developed human society operating at the technological ceiling of their era. And then they vanish from the archaeological record. Their tools stop appearing in the sediment. Their cave sites fall silent. Whatever they believed about the world, whatever languages they spoke, whatever rituals carried them through the long winters, all of it disappears within a window so narrow that archaeologists still debate whether they died out, migrated, or were absorbed into the cultures that followed them. The honest answer is that we do not know. The cold that killed the mammoth may have killed them as well. Or the warming that ended the cold may have ended them. The record is silent in a way that only erased peoples can be silent. What makes the last glacial maximum particularly disturbing is the suspicion that hangs over the extinctions themselves. Some researchers, examining the precise timing of the megafaunal collapse, have argued that the cold alone cannot explain what happened. The mammoth had survived previous glaciations. The cave bear had survived previous warmings. What was different about this was us. Anatomically modern humans had spread across Eurasia by the height of the glaciation, armed with projectile weapons and cooperative hunting strategies the previous interglacials had never seen. The argument is uncomfortable but persistent. The extinctions may not have been finished by the ice. They may have been finished by the hunters who walked out of the ice. If that argument is correct, the last glacial maximum was not only the first cataclysm to erase entire human cultures from the prehistoric world. It was the first time our species reshaped an entire planet's ecology. The first time we left a layer in the geological record. The first deletion we performed on the living world. The ice eventually retreated. The mammoths did not return. Number 6. The Minoan eruption of Thera. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos drove a trench into a hillside on the southern tip of Santorini and began uncovering a Bronze Age city that had been sealed beneath volcanic pumice for over 3,500 years. What emerged from the ash was extraordinary. Multi-story buildings still standing to their second floors. Sophisticated drainage systems running beneath paved streets. Storage jars still upright in their cellars. Frescoes of saffron gatherers, fishermen, and blue monkeys, the pigment still vivid, the brushwork still crisp, as though the painters had stepped away the previous afternoon. The city was called Akrotiri, and it had been buried by one of the most violent volcanic events in human history. Approximately 1,600 BCE, the volcano beneath the island of Santorini detonated. Geologists estimate the eruption ejected roughly 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, making it approximately 4 times more powerful than the Krakatoa eruption of 1883. The Krakatoa explosion was heard 4,800 kilometers away and killed over 36,000 people. Thera was 4 times that. The numbers extend across the planet. Ash from the Theran eruption has been identified in ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice sheet, over 4,000 kilometers from the eruption site. Trace deposits have been detected in tree ring records as far east as China. Pumice from the eruption blanketed the surrounding islands in deposits reaching 60 meters deep in places. The center of Santorini itself collapsed into the sea, leaving the crescent-shaped caldera that defines the island's modern geography. What had been a circular island became a ring of cliffs around a flooded crater 6 kilometers wide. Akrotiri shows almost no human remains. The inhabitants appear to have evacuated, likely warned by preliminary earthquakes and ash falls that preceded the final cataclysm. They left their pottery on shelves. They left their grain in storage jars. They left their tools laid out for work that would never resume. And then they vanished into a Bronze Age world that was about to end. Because Akrotiri was only the prelude. 110 kilometers to the south lay the island of Crete. And on Crete lived the Minoans, the first true civilization in European history. They had built palace complexes at Knossos, Phastos Mallia, and Zakros. They possessed writing systems that have still not been fully deciphered. They maintained trade networks reaching from Egypt to the Levant to the Iberian Peninsula. They produced art of a sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. They were not a culture. They were a civilization at the height of its power. When Thera collapsed, the sea rose. Tsunami modeling suggests waves between 9 and 15 meters struck the northern coast of Crete within 30 minutes of the caldera collapse. Geological surveys along Cretan beaches have identified tsunami deposits, layers of marine sediment, and pumice driven hundreds of meters inland by walls of water, moving at speeds the Minoans had no framework to comprehend. Harbor installations were destroyed. Coastal towns were obliterated. The Minoan fleet, the foundation of their economic and military dominance across the eastern Mediterranean, was likely crippled in a single afternoon. But here's where the destruction becomes genuinely systemic. The eruption injected enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating aerosol layers that dimmed sunlight across the northern hemisphere for years. Tree ring chronologies from oak deposits in Ireland and bristlecone pines in California show pronounced growth anomalies consistent with a sudden volcanic cooling event in the mid-2nd millennium BCE. For a civilization already reeling from tsunamis and ashfall, years of failed harvests followed. Cretan agriculture, dependent on predictable Mediterranean rainfall patterns, faltered. Trade networks frayed as partners across the eastern Mediterranean experienced their own crop failures and political instability. The Minoans did not fall in a single day. They unraveled. Within a few generations of the Thera eruption, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland had moved into the Cretan palace complexes. The Minoan script known as Linear A was abandoned. Their artistic traditions were absorbed, adapted, and replaced. A civilization that had thrived for over 1,000 years, that had built the foundations of European culture, that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean from the sea, was consumed by a culture that had been subordinate to it within living memory. What makes the Theran eruption particularly haunting is its place in cultural memory. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato described in two of his dialogues a powerful island civilization, advanced in art and seamanship, that ruled the Mediterranean from a circular island until it was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe and swallowed by the sea. He called it Atlantis. The parallels to the Minoan collapse are precise enough that scholars beginning with KT. Frost in 1909 have argued Plato's Atlantis is a distorted memory of Thera and the civilization it erased. An advanced island culture, a catastrophic destruction from within the earth, a vanishing beneath the waves. A story that survived as myth because the reality had become incomprehensible. The Minoans built palaces that would not be excavated for over 3,000 years. They painted walls that would not be seen again until the 20th century. They lived on shorelines that the sea reclaimed in an afternoon. And the volcano that destroyed them still sits in the middle of the caldera it created, dormant but not extinct, surrounded by the white-walled tourist villages of modern Santorini. Visitors photograph the sunsets without understanding that they are standing on the rim of the wound that killed Europe's first great civilization. Number 5. The 4.2 kiloyear event, the drought that killed the first empires. In 1993, geologist Harvey Weiss at Yale University published a paper in Science that connected a single climatic event to the simultaneous collapse of multiple civilizations across 3 continents. His excavations at Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria had revealed something troubling. A thriving urban center, part of the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, had been abruptly abandoned around 2200 BCE. The soil layers told the story. Beneath the abandonment horizon lay the remains of a prosperous city. Above it, centuries of wind-blown dust and sand, no destruction by war, no evidence of plague. The inhabitants simply left, and the desert moved in. What Weiss proposed was radical. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad, and stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, didn't fall to invasion or internal revolt. It was destroyed by drought. A severe aridification event beginning around 2200 BCE turned the fertile agricultural heartland of northern Mesopotamia into dust. The cities that depended on rain-fed agriculture could no longer produce food. Populations fled southward toward the irrigated lands along the Tigris and Euphrates, creating refugee crises that overwhelmed the remaining infrastructure. The empire fragmented. Within decades, the most powerful political entity the world had ever seen had ceased to exist. The numbers buried in the sediment confirm what the abandoned cities suggest. Marine and lake cores from across Mesopotamia show that wind-blown dust levels increased 5-fold during this period. 5 times the normal atmospheric load of pulverized Earth, year after year, decade after decade, for 2 centuries. The air itself had changed. The sky that had hung over Sargon's coronation was not the sky his grandchildren breathed under. Rainfall patterns that had sustained agriculture since the dawn of farming had simply stopped behaving the way human civilization had been built to assume they would. But here's where the event becomes genuinely terrifying. The Akkadian collapse was only one piece of the catastrophe. The 4.2 kiloyear event left its signature across the entire planet. Speleothum records from caves in Israel, Iran, China, and Italy confirm a sharp reduction in rainfall spanning several centuries. Marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman and lake records from the Tibetan Plateau show the same fingerprint at the same time. Something disrupted global precipitation patterns on a scale that affected civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers, civilizations that had no knowledge of each other's existence. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids of Giza, who had maintained centralized authority for nearly 1,000 years, lost control. The Nile's annual floods, the foundation of Egyptian agriculture, diminished catastrophically. Provincial governors who lived through the collapse left inscriptions describing conditions where the entire South was dying of hunger, where neighbors ate their own children, where the desert advanced on cities that had stood for centuries. The Old Kingdom fractured into competing provincial authorities during the First Intermediate Period, a century of chaos that Egyptians would remember as a dark age for millennia afterward. Simultaneously, 4,000 kilometers to the east, the Indus Valley civilization was collapsing. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, home to millions of people across the Indus Plain, entered terminal decline. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system weakened as monsoon patterns shifted. Urban populations dispersed into smaller villages. The sophisticated urban planning, the standardized weights, the extensive trade networks, the writing system that we still cannot read, all of it disintegrated. Within 2 centuries, the cities were abandoned. One of the 3 cradles of human civilization simply dissolved into the dust that was settling over everything. The pattern is the same in every region. Abandoned cities buried under windblown silt. Dried riverbeds where boats once carried grain. Cracked clay plains where wheat had grown for 40 generations. Irrigation canals choked with sediment, granaries empty, palaces silent. The infrastructure of the first civilizations, the world's first experiment in dense, urban, literate human life, hollowed out by an enemy no army could march against. What makes the 4.2 kiloyear event the most disturbing entry on this list is not its death toll, though its death toll was staggering. It is the pattern it reveals. A single climatic shift simultaneously destroyed civilizations that had no concept of each other's suffering. The Akkadians did not know Egypt was starving. The Egyptians had no awareness of the Indus Valley's collapse. The farmers of Mohenjo-Daro never heard the word Akkad. Each civilization experienced its destruction as local and incomprehensible, as the wrath of its own particular gods, as the failure of its own particular kings. None of them understood that the same force was dismantling human achievement across the entire world at the same time. The event was so significant, so deeply etched into the geological record of the planet itself, that in 2018 the International Commission on Stratigraphy formally designated it the boundary marker for the current geological age. We live in the Megalaean, an age named for the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. The drought that killed the world's first empires is not a footnote in human history. It is the line in the rock that defines the epoch we still inhabit. The 4.2 kiloyear event lasted approximately 200 to 300 years. It was not a single bad season or a decade of hardship. It was centuries of diminished rainfall, failed harvests, and collapsing social order. Civilizations that had taken 1,000 years to build were erased in generations. And the mechanism that drove it, a shift in atmospheric circulation that no king could petition and no general could fight, requires nothing more exotic than the planet's own restless weather to activate again. The drought ended eventually. Cities were eventually rebuilt on different rivers by different peoples. But the dust that settled over Akkad, over Memphis, over Mohenjo-Daro is still there, layered into the earth beneath modern fields, a thin gray line in every core sample, marking the boundary where the first civilizations ended and a quieter, smaller world began. Number 4. The apocalyptic deluge, when the ocean swallowed a civilization whole. In 1997, marine geologist William Ryan and Walter Pittman at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a hypothesis that would connect ancient geology to humanity's oldest story. Using sonar mapping and sediment cores from the floor of the Black Sea, they proposed that approximately 7,600 years ago, around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea breached the land barrier at the Bosphorus Strait and poured into what had been a freshwater lake sitting far below modern sea level. The flood was catastrophic, rapid, and devastating to the farming communities that had settled along the lake's fertile shores. Ryan and Pittman suggested this event might be the historical basis for the flood narratives found across the ancient world, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical story of Noah, and the deluge myths preserved in Greek tradition. The evidence beneath the Black Sea is striking. Sonar surveys have revealed ancient shorelines submerged 150 meters below the current surface. Sediment cores show an abrupt transition from freshwater deposits to marine sediments, a boundary so sharp it suggests the change happened in geological terms almost overnight. Below that boundary, freshwater mollusks. Above it, saltwater species appear suddenly and completely. Something transformed the Black Sea from a freshwater body to a saltwater one in a period too brief for gradual transition. Ryan and Pittman's models estimated the flood's intensity at approximately 200 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls. Saltwater cascaded through the Bosphorus Channel with enough force to cut a gorge still visible in bathymetric surveys. The lake's surface rose by as much as 15 centimeters per day. Shorelines retreated by over a kilometer daily in the flat northern sections of the basin. Within months, an area covering thousands of square kilometers was submerged. Farming communities that had cultivated the lakeshore for generations watched the water advance toward their fields, their homes, their burial grounds, with no way to stop it, and nowhere along the shore to retreat. The numbers defy comprehension. A freshwater lake the size of a small sea was raised by 150 meters in a window measured not in millennia, but in months. The roar of the inflow would have been audible for hundreds of kilometers. Anyone standing on the southern shore would have seen a wall of salt water advancing toward them at walking pace, slow enough to flee, but fast enough to consume everything they could not carry. Generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge, the painstaking work of clearing land, breeding crops, building permanent dwellings, all of it sliding underwater while the people who had built it watched. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The lake shore that drowned was not marginal territory. It was prime Neolithic real estate. The fertile lowlands surrounding a freshwater lake in a semi-arid region would have supported some of the most productive farmland in the ancient Near East. Communities in the broader region were already growing wheat, barley, and lentils, raising livestock and building permanent structures. The settlements destroyed by the deluge may have represented one of the densest concentrations of early agricultural civilization on Earth. And the archaeological record from those settlements is buried under 150 meters of saltwater, effectively inaccessible. In 2000, underwater explorer Robert Ballard, famous for locating the wreck of the Titanic, conducted expeditions to the Black Sea floor and reported finding evidence of ancient shorelines and possible man-made structures preserved in the anoxic deep water. The Black Sea's unique chemistry, its deep layers contain almost no dissolved oxygen, means that organic materials on the seafloor does not decompose normally. Wooden structures, biological remains, tools that would have disintegrated millennia ago in any other body of water might still exist in the darkness 150 meters down, perfectly preserved beyond practical excavation. A civilization frozen in a museum no one can enter. What makes the Black Sea deluge particularly haunting is its echo. The flood stories that emerged thousands of years later across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Greek world describe the same essential event. A righteous remnant, a rising water that consumed the known world, a boat, a landing on a mountain after the water receded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in cuneiform on clay tablets in ancient Sumer, predates the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years and describes a deluge sent to destroy humanity. The biblical Noah narrative preserves the same structural memory. The Greek myth of Deucalion records a flood survived by a single couple in a chest that came to rest on Mount Parnassus. 3 civilizations, separated by language and centuries, telling the same story about water that rose until the world drowned. The debate over the deluge's speed and scale continues. Some geologists argue the flooding was more gradual, occurring over centuries rather than months. Others contest the volume and rate proposed by Ryan and Pittman. But what remains undisputed is the fundamental event. The Black Sea was once a smaller, lower freshwater body. It became a larger, higher saltwater sea. People lived on the shores that are now submerged. And the cultural memory of a catastrophic flood persists across every civilization that emerged in the surrounding region, encoded in scripture and epic for so long that we forgot it to describe something real. Whatever those communities built, whatever they believed, whatever names they had for the lake that fed them, the water took it all. Their descendants carried the story forward in fragments, retelling the destruction of a world they had never seen until the story itself became the only artifact that survived. Beneath the Black Sea, the original shorelines remain where they were left, dark and unvisited, the foundations of the first drowned world, still waiting in water that no longer remembers it was ever a lake. Number 3. Doggerland, the lost continent beneath the North Sea. In 1931, a British fishing trawler called the Kalinda hauled its nets from the floor of the North Sea between England and Denmark and pulled up something that should not have existed. Tangled in the catch was a lump of ancient peat, and embedded within that peat was a barbed antler harpoon point, unmistakably shaped by a human hand. The artifact had been dredged from 40 meters beneath the open ocean. No coastline for hundreds of kilometers, no island, no explanation except one. Someone had stood on that ground. The land they stood on is called Doggerland, and at its maximum extent it was not a fringe, not a peninsula, not a thin causeway between two coasts. It was a continent in miniature. During the last glacial maximum, when global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters below their current line, the entire basin of the modern North Sea was dry. Doggerland connected what is now eastern England to the Netherlands, Denmark, and the lowlands of northern Germany in a single unbroken landmass. River valleys cut across its interior, forests covered its hills. Marshes and estuaries fed enormous wetlands teeming with fish and waterfowl. Herds of red deer, aurochs, wild horse, and elk moved across its plains. Mammoth had walked there in earlier millennia, and their tusks still rest in the seabed sediment. And people live there, for thousands of years. Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities occupied Doggerland from the end of the last ice age onward, building seasonal camps along its rivers, hunting its game, fishing its lagoons, burying their dead in ground that no archaeologist will ever excavate. They were not primitive. They were skilled foragers operating within one of the richest ecosystems in post-glacial Europe. Their tools were precise. Their settlements were organized. Their networks of trade and movement stretched across a territory larger than modern Britain itself. In 2007, archaeologist Vince Gaffney at the University of Birmingham used seismic survey data collected by the North Sea oil industry to reconstruct Doggerland's topography in unprecedented detail. His team mapped river systems, lake basins, coastal estuaries, and ridgelines beneath the seafloor. What emerged from the data was a country, not a fragment, not a land bridge. A country with geography as varied and habitable as anywhere in Mesolithic Europe, and a population that may have numbered in the tens of thousands at its peak. By around 6200 BCE, that country was already dying. Rising sea levels from the melting Scandinavian and Laurentide ice sheets had been eating Doggerland from its edges inward for millennia. Each generation inherited a slightly smaller homeland. Coastlines crept inland. Hunting grounds turned to salt marsh. River mouths drowned and became estuaries, then bays, then open sea. By the early 6th millennium BCE, Doggerland had been reduced to a low-lying archipelago, a chain of islands and marshlands surrounded on every side by water that had once been forest. Then the seafloor moved. Off the coast of Norway, on the edge of the continental shelf, a slab of seabed roughly the size of Scotland detached and slid into the deep ocean. The Storegga slide displaced an estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment in a single submarine collapse, one of the largest landslides preserved anywhere in the geological record. The volume of material that moved was equivalent to a block of earth 300 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, and several hundred meters thick, all of it collapsing into the Norwegian Sea in minutes. The tsunami it generated radiated outward in every direction. Waves estimated at over 20 meters high struck the coast of Norway. The Shetland Islands, directly in the path, were swept by walls of water that left sediment deposits dozens of meters above modern sea level. Eastern Scotland was inundated by waves still tall enough, after crossing hundreds of kilometers of open water, to carry marine sand 80 kilometers inland from the coastline. Geologists tracing the Storegga deposit through coastal peat bogs have followed its fingerprint around the entire northern rim of the North Sea. And in the middle of that sea, the last surviving fragments of Doggerland were already lying barely above the waterline. There was no high ground. There was nowhere to climb. The remnant islands of what had once been a continent were low, flat, and exposed on every side. The wave reached them without warning and without obstruction. Whatever communities still clung to the final inhabited corners of the old homeland, whatever villages, whatever camps, whatever burial grounds, whatever children sleeping in whatever shelters, the water took all of it in a single afternoon. After the Storegga wave receded, the rising sea did the rest. Within decades, the archipelago was gone. Within a century, even the highest ridges of what had once been the heart of the continent were beneath cold North Sea water. The transformation was complete. A landmass that had supported human life for thousands of years became seafloor, and the people who had called it home became sediment, ground into the same layer of marine clay that now buries their tools. We know they were there because the evidence keeps surfacing. North Sea fishing trawlers have, for over a century, dredged up mammoth tusks, flint blades, antler points, carved bone fragments, and human remains in their nets. A hand axe recovered in 2019 from sediment pulled off the seabed has been dated to roughly 50,000 years ago, evidence that the territory had been inhabited on and off across multiple human species far longer than the Mesolithic occupation that ended in the flood. Fragments of skulls, fragments of jaws. The bones of people whose names were spoken in languages no living human has ever heard. What makes Doggerland particularly haunting is the totality of its erasure. This is not a buried ruin awaiting excavation. This is not a city beneath the sand. This is an entire inhabited landscape, with its rivers and its hills and its villages and its dead, sealed under 40 meters of dark, cold water, in a sea that the descendants of its drowned inhabitants now fish for cod. The archaeology that would tell us who these people were, what they believed, what they made, what they understood about the world they lived in, is functionally inaccessible. We will never read their stories. We will never map their settlements. We will never know the names of the rivers they drank from. A continent at the heart of Europe was wiped from the map within a single human generation, and the ocean that swallowed it has been keeping the secret ever since. Number 2. The Younger Dryas impact when the sky struck back. In 2007, nuclear physicist Richard Firestone and a team of 25 researchers published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, proposing something that the archaeological community had spent decades resisting. Approximately 12,800 years ago, at precisely the moment when the planet was finally clawing its way out of the last ice age, something arrived from space. A comet or asteroid, likely fragmenting as it tore through the upper atmosphere, detonated over North America. The leading candidate for the impact zone is the Laurentide ice sheet, the continent-sized glacier that still covered most of Canada and the northern United States. The object may never have left a conventional crater. It may have exploded as an airburst, transferring its energy into the ice and the atmosphere rather than into bedrock. But what it triggered is written into the geological record of 3 continents. The planet went cold, not gradually, not over centuries. Within decades, possibly within a single human lifetime, the warming that had been melting the great ice sheets for thousands of years reversed. Greenland ice cores show North Atlantic temperatures collapsing by as much as 7 degrees Celsius. The interglacial recovery simply stopped, as though someone had unplugged the sun. What followed is called the Younger Dryas. 1,200 years of near-glacial cold dropped onto a world that had been weeks away from spring. Glaciers stabilized, some advanced again. The grasslands that had been creeping northward across the thawing continents withered. An entire climatic future was canceled. The signature of the event is buried in a thin, dark layer found at over 50 sites across 4 continents. Geologists call it the black mat. Beneath it, the bones of Ice Age animals and the tools of Ice Age humans. Above it, almost nothing for 1,000 years. Within the layer itself, materials that have no business existing in ordinary sediment. Nanodiamonds. Microscopic crystals that form only under the kind of temperature and pressure delivered by cosmic impact or detonation. Microspherules, tiny glass beads created when rock or soil is flash melted in midair and resolidifies as it falls. Elevated platinum and iridium, elements vanishingly rare in Earth's crust but abundant in extraterrestrial material. And in many North American sites, a carbon-rich charcoal signature consistent with continent-spanning wildfires igniting simultaneously. The numbers are staggering. Some models suggest that within hours of the airburst, fires consumed an estimated 9% of the planet's biomass. Smoke and soot poured into the stratosphere alongside whatever the impact itself had vaporized. The atmospheric loading darkened skies across the northern hemisphere. Photosynthesis faltered. Food chains buckled. And then the cold arrived to finish what the fire had started. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The Younger Dryas boundary does not just mark a climate event. It marks a disappearance. The Clovis culture, one of the earliest, most widespread, and most archaeologically visible human populations in the Americas, vanishes from the record at this exact horizon. Their distinctive fluted spear points, found by the thousands in sediment layers beneath the black mat, simply stop being manufactured above it. These were not isolated bands. The Clovis people had spread across the continent. They had developed a recognizable technology, a coordinated hunting tradition, a foothold in a new world. And then, in geological terms, they were gone. They were not the only ones. The Americas experienced a megafaunal extinction of staggering proportions in the same narrow window. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, American camels, American horses, dire wolves, short-faced bears that stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs. Approximately 35 genera of large mammals erased from 2 continents in a geological blink. Species that had survived multiple ice ages, multiple interglacial swings, multiple shifts in vegetation and predator pressure, all collapsing within the same horizon. The black mat lies above their last bones like a lid. The debate over the impact hypothesis remains fierce. Critics argue the nanodiamonds could form through other processes. They argue the extinctions were the work of human overhunting. They argue the climate reversal was triggered by glacial fault water disrupting Atlantic circulation rather than by anything from space. Each alternative explanation has its defenders, and the science is still being fought out in journals and conference halls. But the coincidence does not soften under scrutiny. At precisely 12,800 years ago, temperatures collapsed, fires burned across a continent, an entire human culture disappeared, dozens of megafaunal species went extinct, and a sediment layer rich in impact-consistent materials was deposited from California to the Netherlands. Whether the trigger was a comet, a meltwater pulse, or some convergence of forces we have not yet named, the event itself is not in question. A world was ending. What makes this entry particularly unsettling is what it implies about the trajectory of everything that came after. If the Younger Dryas was indeed initiated by an object from space, then the entire architecture of human history pivoted on a piece of cosmic debris that no one saw coming. The Clovis people, who had walked from Beringia and colonized a hemisphere, were erased. Whatever cities they might have built, whatever traditions might have descended from them, whatever civilizations the Americas might have produced thousands of years earlier than they did, none of it materialized. The survivors started over in a frozen world, surrounded by the bones of animals that would never walk the earth again, beneath a sky that had just demonstrated what it was capable of. And the sky has not changed. The orbits that delivered that object are still occupied. The next one is somewhere out there now, and we are no better at seeing it coming than the Clovis people were. Number 1. Toba and the bottleneck. Approximately 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, the Earth opened. The Toba supervolcano detonated in an eruption so violent that geologists ranking volcanic events across the last 2 million years place nothing else beside it. It stands alone. The largest eruption in 2 million years of planetary history, and it happened while our species was already walking the Earth. The numbers exist, but the mind refuses to hold them. Roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material were ejected into the atmosphere in a single geological convulsion. To translate that figure into something approaching comprehension, imagine the entire volume of Lake Superior lifted into the sky as pulverized rock and ash. Ash columns rose over 30 kilometers into the atmosphere, punching through the troposphere and into the stratosphere, where weather cannot scrub them away. The eruption did not respect distance. Ash layers up to 15 centimeters thick have been identified in soil deposits across India, more than 3,000 kilometers from the source, blanketing an entire subcontinent in a gray shroud thick enough to bury a child to the knee. The caldera left behind is now a lake. Lake Toba stretches 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, a scar so massive that astronauts can identify it from low Earth orbit without instruments. The hole the eruption left in the Earth's crust is large enough to contain a small country. But the crater is not what killed. What killed was the sky. The eruption injected staggering quantities of sulfur dioxide and fine ash into the stratosphere, creating an aerosol veil that diffused sunlight across the entire planet. Global temperatures collapsed. Models reconstructed from ice cores, sediment data, and atmospheric chemistry suggest a volcanic winter lasting between 6 and 10 years, with regional cooling far more severe than the global average. Some models extend the climatic disruption further, proposing a cooling period that may have persisted for as long as 1,000 years. The growing seasons that early humans depended on did not shorten. They vanished. Forests died standing. Grasslands turned to dust. The animals our ancestors hunted starved before the humans hunting them did. And here is where the geology stops being abstract and becomes personal. In the late 1990s, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois connected the Toba eruption to a problem that had haunted geneticists for decades. Human genetic diversity, measured across our entire global population of 8 billion, is extraordinarily, almost impossibly low. A single troop of chimpanzees in a single forest in Central Africa carries more genetic variation than every human being alive today combined. Something happened to our ancestors. Something compressed the entire human lineage through a needle so narrow that we have not yet recovered the diversity we lost. The estimates are difficult to read without flinching. Genetic evidence suggests that the total human breeding population may have collapsed to between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Not 3,000 in a single region, not 10,000 in a single valley. 3 to 10,000 on the entire planet. Every continent we had reached, every coastline we had colonized, every cave and shelter and river valley our ancestors had learned to survive in, reduced to a population small enough to fit inside a single sports stadium with empty seats to spare. Every human being who has ever lived after that moment. Every farmer who planted the first seed. Every mason who cut the first stone. Every poet, every emperor, every child born in every city across every continent. All of it descends from a handful of survivors who endured a sky that had turned to poison. The debate continues. Some archaeologists have argued that the bottleneck was less severe than Ambrose proposed, pointing to sites in Africa and India where human activity appears to continue across the Toba layer without obvious interruption. The genetic signal is real, but its cause remains contested. Other forces, disease, climatic oscillation, slower demographic pressure, could have produced a similar compression. The science is unfinished, but the alignment is difficult to dismiss. The largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years occurred at almost precisely the moment our species was reduced to a population thinner than a small town. Coincidence is permitted as a hypothesis. It is not a comfortable one. Consider what this means. The entire forward trajectory of human existence, every civilization that would rise and fall, every language that would be spoken and born and lost, every catastrophe we have spent this countdown describing, balanced on whether a few thousand hungry, frightened people could keep their children alive beneath a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. The Mediterranean would not refill into a sea that humans would sail. The pyramids would not be raised. Doggerland would never be settled and would never be drowned. The Akkadian Empire would not exist to be erased by drought. None of it. None of the achievements, none of the suffering, none of the memory. Erased before it was ever written. What makes Toba the most disturbing entries on this list is not its scale, though its scale is the largest. It is what it reveals about the foundation we stand on. Human history does not rest on a stable platform that occasionally trembles. It rests on a near miss. We are not the inevitable result of evolution's long climb. We are the descendants of a few thousand survivors who happened to be in the right valleys, the right caves, the right scraps of inhabited land when the sky closed and the temperature dropped and the food disappeared. Everything we have built since then sits on top of that accident. The volcano is still there. The caldera is now a lake, deep and dark and 505 meters at its deepest point. Tourists swim in it. Boats cross it. The water reflects a sky that has long since cleared. And somewhere beneath the sediment at its floor, the magma chamber that emptied 74,000 years ago is slowly, patiently refilling. 7 events. 7 moments when the ground gave way, when the sky turned to poison, when the sea climbed walls it had no business climbing, when the rain simply stopped coming. Each one erased something that cannot be recovered. Languages no tongue will ever speak again. Settlements no shovel will ever uncover. People whose names were never written, whose faces were never drawn, whose stories ended in water or ash or silence. The earth keeps its own ledger. It does not consult ours. Civilizations rise in the narrow windows when the climate holds steady, when the ground stays still, when the sky stays clear. Those windows close without warning. They have closed before. They will close again. The bones are still down there. The ash is still in the ice. The water is still rising. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.